G'day guys, welcome to my 5th tutorial. My name's Shane and I'm going to be talking about PHP loops. Now we're going to be looking at arrays in a lot more depth in this tutorial, as promised. So hopefully they'll start to make a little bit more sense once we start working with loops, which often will rely heavily on the use of arrays. You'll probably find in your future programming endeavors. So let's get started. Now the first loop that I want to talk about is the for loop. Probably one of the slightly trickier loops, but I think it being one of the most common is probably the best place to start. So what I'm going to do first is create an array. Now I'm going to create a fruits array again. So fruits equals array. I'm going to put an apple in there. I'm going to put a banana in there. We'll use pear and watermelon. Okay, save that. Now, what I want to do is I just want to output these to our web page on a new line each. Okay, so we're going to output one pair per line, as opposed to now we can always go echo $fruits 0, and we'll put a line break in there. We can go $fruits 1. Don't forget those dot operators, very important. $fruits 2. And remember, those dot operators are significantly, well, very important when splitting up variables and also strings. So can't stress enough, don't forget them. And we can go $fruits 3 for our last value. Now, there we go. So apple, banana, pear, watermelon, very simple. But that is a little bit of work. Let's just say this list of fruits is maybe stored in a text file, for example. We might have a massive shopping list in a text file. For example, maybe a customer order, right? Really simple website. We don't want to have to go in and manually edit this code every single time something adds to the list, okay? So instead, what we're going to do is we're just going to assume that we don't know how big this array is. We don't know what values are in it. It could be any size, but no matter what size it is and what's inside it, we want to punch everything out to the page, okay? So that is not a very good method if that's what you want to achieve. Don't recommend it, and I'm going to show you a way that will allow us to achieve it programmatically without knowing how big the array is. PHP can do that work for us. No pun intended. So the first loop is a for loop. So we're going to type for, open brackets. Now this takes 3 arguments. Okay. Now the first argument we're gonna assign a variable, an integer. In this case, this is going to be the most common way we're going to do it, and this is the way I'm going to teach you. $I stands for integer. That's just common programming practice. You'll find a lot of programmers will do that across varying languages. It's very common. For $I equals 0. So we're going to start at index 0 of our array, because we all know, like in the second tutorial, like I mentioned, that is index 0, index 1, 2, and 3. So I is going to be our index pointer. Okay, so that's going to point our PHP processor to the different array values for us automatically, and that's going to make a lot more sense in a moment. So this piece of code here, this little variable assignment occurs at the very beginning of our loop, and it happens once. Okay, now the second section, this is our condition. So while this is true, now this is similar to how our if statement conditions worked. While this is true, we're going to continue to execute our loop, and things are going to keep happening. Okay, so while I is less than size of fruits. Now you might remember me demonstrating the size of function in the second tutorial, and I briefly showed you a for loop. Well, this is what's happening. So while the I variable, which starts at 0, is less than the size of fruits, which in this case is going to be 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 values in there. So that's going to return 4 while it's less than. So up to and including 3, because obviously 4 is not less than 4, we're going to continue to execute this loop. And at the end of each loop cycle, here, this is the code that's going to run. Now, you can go I equals I plus 1, for example, because we want to increase I by 1 every time. Because what's going to happen is we're going to have this $I variable, right? And it's going to start at 0, and then it's going to go up by 1. It's going to become 1. It's going to become 2, and then it's going to go 3. Now, the use with this is, and why that's handy to us, is that we can actually tell it. We can tell PHP to look at the fruits array index $I. So that can be 0, 1, 2, or 3 in this case. Okay, so I is ever changing, but I is always going to start at 0, which will be the start of our array, and it's only going to go up to the end of our array. So we can actually work with every single array value in our loop here every time the loop runs. So that's really, really, really useful stuff. Really practical if you're working with a MySQL database. Maybe you want to get a list of members, for example, and you can loop through them very similarly using similar tactics. Now, we can do I equals I plus 1, or there's actually a shortcut to increase I by 1. That works, or you can just say I plus plus, and that's just going to add 1 to the I integer. Obviously, minus minus is going to decrement it by a value, but we want to increment it in this case. Okay, so close your brackets, open your curly brackets or your braces, and in here we're going to execute some very simple code. We're going to say echo $fruits $I. So that's going to say, okay, look at the value at this index. So to begin, our loop starts at 0. Okay, so it's going to look at, well, index 0 being apple. The next time it runs, it's going to say, well, it's going to look again. It'll be like, oh, well, is I less than the size of fruits? So I's been incremented by 1, so I is 1 now. Is it less than the size of fruits? Well, size of fruits is 4, so yes, I is less than 4. So it's going to run again, and we're going to output the fruit. Now, I'm going to throw a line break in here just to make it a little bit tidier on our page. If I run that, we're going to get the exact same output as before. As you can see, it hasn't changed. In fact, just to demonstrate this a little bit for you, I'm going to put a block bracket in there. And I'm going to output our I variable, just like that. Okay. So I've just put those little block brackets in there, and also the I variable, which is an integer, but it's going to convert that to a string for us because we're echoing that to the page. So PHP knows, like I said, doesn't care about data types, handles that for us. So it's very, very, very nice in that respect, very forgiving. So I'm going to refresh this, and you'll notice here, index 0 apple, right? Index 1 banana, 2 pear, 3 watermelon. So our loop is running for every single value in this array, just because of our condition here, primarily, while $I is less than size of fruits. Now, let's say, for example, I made it less than or equal to. So what that would do is that would say, okay, I start at index 0, which is fine. And then it's going to become 1 at the end of the first loop, because we're incrementing it by 1 at the end of each loop. And then it's going to become 2, then 3, and then I will become 4, but it's actually going to return true, because it will be less than or equal to size of fruits, which is 4. So it'll be equal to the size of fruits, which means it's actually going to run this loop for a 5th time, but we only have 4 values in this array. So you're going to get a similar error to what I demonstrated in the second tutorial, and you'll get an undefined offset error, just like that. So less than or equal to, or less than, very important. Just as a quick example, you could use less than or equal to if you wanted. In some cases, it's useful, and we can start I at 1. Okay, now you're still going to get that undefined offset error. Now, because it's going to start I at 1, we're not going to get apple because we're starting at 1. So you'll notice here apple's disappeared. but you're still going to get that undefined offset error because we're still going up to the number 4. So instead what you can do is you can say I minus 1 and I minus 1, and what that'll do is that'll just put I back down to 0 again. Oops, apologies for that. There, just like that. So that'll start I from 1 for anything you want to output to the page, but when you're referencing your array values, you're going to minus it by 1, so it never quite reaches 4, which is where we're getting our error. And it'll actually just start it from 0 again. Just a little example, but when you muck around with it a little bit, that will make a lot more sense. I strongly encourage you to practice loops. You could watch this video a million times, but it really helps just to work with them yourself and have a little bit of a practice with your own arrays. And arrays are a very good way to learn how to use loops. Okay, so another loop we're going to use is to achieve the same thing, is the for each loop. Okay, now what for each does is, for each will essentially loop for every value in an array. Very simple. We don't get extra controls like we do in the for loop we did before. It's just going to loop for every value in the array. We don't really get to play around with it much. We don't get that I integer built in. We have to make that ourselves if we want it. So in this case, we're going to say for each $fruits as $fruit, open brackets, braces, sorry. So we're going to open the block. Now, just checking for errors, that's all fine. So what this is doing here is, okay, this is taking our fruits array, and we're starting at the very first value, apple, and it's saying, okay, we'll set the first value as $fruit. So it's actually assigning that first value to our new fruit variable. So if I were to echo $fruit, and I'll throw a line break in there as well, just for formatting. Bam, there it is, just like that. So that'll actually run through every value in the fruits array and assign each value to fruit every time we run this code. Okay, so each time round that fruit variable is referring to one of our array values in order. Okay, so again, very useful. We don't get quite as much functionality to play with, whereas with the for statement, we can maybe start in the middle of the array if we want. We can set I equal to 2, for example, or I equals 1, whatever you like. You don't have to start from the start. Whereas with for each, you work with every array value, so you might not use it as much, but it's nice and tidy, and it's a little bit easier on the eye, and it's very easy to use. Another one we're going to use is and look at, and we're going to be using it a lot when we work with databases, is the while loop. So for example, in this scenario, I'm actually going to create the while loop just like our for loop. So I'm going to create a variable called $I equals 0, just like our for loop had, and I'm going to say while $I is less than size of fruits, okay, which returns 4. We know that because we have 4 values in the fruits array. I'm going to echo fruits $I to the page with a line break. Now, before I run this code, there's one major problem with it. I is never actually increasing. So this loop is going to run over and over and over again, because at first, I being 0 is less than the size of fruits, because the size of fruits is 4. It's going to run line 6. It's going to run this code. And then what it's going to do is it's going to hit the end. It's like, oh, cool, all right. It's going to jump back up and it will check the condition again. I hasn't changed. I is still 0. So I is less than 4. And it will run again and again and again. And we've actually found ourselves in an endless loop. Not a fun situation. Essentially, that's just going to run and run and run until the PHP script times out. By default, it's often about 30 seconds. Some web hosts will have it less, some have it more. You might have even changed it yourself. It could even be 5 days. in which case just restart your web server if you find that's a problem, because it will sometimes continue to run in the background. It's not a fun time. It will slow things down and affect other users if you're on a live web server. So what we need to do is similar to our for loop, increment I by 1, just like that. So I will actually change, and eventually this condition will no longer be met and it will return false, and it will stop executing this code. So I'm just going to refresh that, and bam, there it is again. I know nothing changed, and that's because it's doing the exact same work as before. Now we can set I equal to 1, for example, and we will lose apple because it's going to start with banana being our index of 1. Okay, so I invite you to muck around with that, have a bit of a play. This is just an overview again, but we're going to be working with while loops a lot more, I can assure you, in the future. Okay, so the last loop that I wanted to show you, I'm going to leave our I there. Okay, is the do while loop. So do. Now we open our block already, so we don't actually check any condition yet. So we don't make sure, we don't go, oh, you know, is I less than the size of our fruits array? Instead, we just go, nah, screw it, and just start punching out code straight away. So we're going to say do echo fruits $I. So in this case, that's index 0 for the first run of our loop, and we're going to put a line break in there. And then after that, we're actually going to put our condition at the end, okay? So here we're going to say while $I is less than size of $fruits, just like that. And don't forget the semicolon. And we're gonna increment I down here, okay? Make sure you do that. You don't want that endless loop, because that's going to happen again if you're not careful. Okay, so if I refresh that, boom, same output, no worries. Well, same as the other loops, unless I make I1, of course. Except one major difference, we're not checking the condition before the loop runs, we're actually checking it at the end. Now that can cause problems. Let's assume that our fruits array has nothing in it. I think it should work. If I just remove those values there, save, refresh, bam, we have an error. So undefined offset 0, and the reason for that is because we're not actually checking a condition prior to running our loop. So what's happening is it's just going, okay, we're just going to run that, and then before we run for a second time, we're going to check this condition, and if that checks out, then we'll run again. It's not because size of fruits is giving us 0. Okay, see, if we were to compare that to, if I go back to our old loop, so I'm just gonna remove this code, and we just turn it back into our old while loop. That should actually remove our error, and the reason's because, as you can see there, the reason's because it actually checks this condition first before trying to access this value which does not exist, because we have nothing in our array anymore. So that's a fundamental difference of the do while loop, and sometimes it can be extremely useful. You're probably not going to use it as often as your for loop or your while loop, because usually you're going to want to check a condition first, but sometimes if you know that you're definitely running something a minimum of once, this is useful because you can check the condition later. So it's a really nifty loop. I reckon it's probably underused. But yeah, again, very useful, and yeah, definitely keep it in the back of your mind, because sometimes, you know, it can just save you a little bit of extra redundant code, and I personally hate redundant code. So I know this tutorial's gone for a little while. I apologize for that. I hope you got something out of it. Thanks very much. In the next tutorial, I'm going to be discussing functions and how we can use those practically in a simple web page. Thank you very much for your time, and I will catch you in the next one.